The tit-for-tat rocket fire has followed two raids, one in Gaza, the other in Damascus, both targeting senior leaders of Islamic Jihad. Was it the continued rocket attacks from the Gaza Strip that had the Israelis at the ready to strike the Iran-backed Palestinian militant group? Or was this a calling card to Tehran? Islamic Jihad often works in tandem with Hamas, but has its own agenda. We'll ask our panel about the timing when Israel's without a government and where its main backer, the United States, has other priorities, what with an embattled president pushing disengagement from the region. But Iran has issues of its own as well. Its proxies and allies are being challenged by street protests in Lebanon and Iraq. And with U.S. sanctions stinging, divisions between moderates and hardliners are now out in the open. What to expect next? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if we're witnessing a proxy war. And joining us from Tel Aviv, pollster and political consultant Dalia Scheindlin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
From London, Abdelbari Atwan, editor-in-chief of Al Rai Al Yum, the news website. Welcome back to the show.
It's my pleasure, my dear.
From Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, associate professor at the University of Tehran. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll be joined later from Washington by Behnam Ben Taleblu, research fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Israel claims it's killed Islamic Jihad's top commander in Gaza. Another senior leader reportedly was absent from his Damascus apartment when it was targeted. Nicholas Rushworth has more.
Early morning airstrikes on Gaza, with Israeli forces killing Bahar Abu el-Atta, a top commander of the Palestinian militant group Islamic Jihad. At the same time, there were reports of another strike on an Islamic Jihad commander in Damascus, attributed to Israel. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Abu el-Atta was a ticking bomb, planning new attacks. He warned of a new round of Israel-Palestinian fighting.
Israel
is not interested in an escalation, but we will do everything necessary to defend ourselves. And I'm saying it in advance, it could take time.
Islamic Jihad held Abu el-Atta's funeral, vowing revenge. One of its leaders said its jihad would continue until the end of the occupation and the liberation of all Palestine. At least 160 rockets were launched from Gaza. They reached parts of southern and central Israel and even as far north as Tel Aviv. Some were intercepted, others hit residential areas. One struck a main road near the city of Ashdod. Schools and businesses in the Gaza Strip and in parts of Israel were closed. This is the most serious escalation in cross-border violence between Israel and the Palestinians in months. It could fuel Israel's increasingly open conflict with Iran and its allies in the Middle East.
Dalia Scheindlin in Tel Aviv, you're close to where those rockets are landing. Tell us what it's like.
Well, there's a strange sense in Tel Aviv today of having a day off. There were sirens early this morning as rockets were fired and intercepted, apparently because we heard the boom. The government has shut down a large swath of the country, bigger than in past situations like this. Schools were closed, universities were closed, many businesses were closed. I heard updates from economic institutions, finance institutions, that regular commercial activity was 10% lower than it normally is for a day like this. So there was a strange sense of quiet in the streets, but everybody is essentially waiting hour by hour to find out if this will escalate or de-escalate. That's the question on everybody's minds in the public, but also among analysts and even politicians, I think, because there is such a sense of uncertainty. It could go one way or it could go the other. And the only way we'll know is based on what happens probably over the next few hours, maximum the next 24 hours. I think we'll have a clearer sense. And everybody is also trying to read the messages coming from the politicians and the political level, of course, the prime minister and the security establishment, to hear what they're saying. We try to parse out their ideas. So when they say this could take a long time, which is one of the things the prime minister said, people think, well, maybe they're planning on a long-term war. On the other hand, when the Israeli leadership says we are not planning on renewing the policy of targeted assassinations, which is something they said in the morning, then it seems like maybe they're trying to keep it restrained. But they've rolled that back already. So there are a lot of mixed messages. And we're all waiting to see how this plays out over the next day or two, with the possibility on everybody's mind that it could turn into a serious escalation and possibly a war.
Earlier, we spoke to our correspondent, Iris Makler. She was reporting that it seemed, according to reports, that for the time being, the rockets from Gaza were coming from Islamic Jihad, not from Hamas. What have you heard, Dalia?
We've heard the same thing. Another, one of the big questions that I think will help us determine where this is going is whether Hamas plans on getting involved and joining the offensive of the rockets. Now, it's up until now, the Israeli news is reporting over 200 rockets fired. The number seems to go up every minute or every hour, probably. But so far as the reports are showing, as far as we know from intelligence, it's mainly Palestinian Islamic Jihad and not Hamas. Hamas is in a very tricky position. We're looking at many layers of, on the political analysis level, as you pointed out in the title of this program. Is this a regional question? Is this a question of domestic Israeli politics? But there's also a question of internal Palestinian political dynamics. Hamas probably is aware that its people, in my reading of the Palestinian public in Gaza, do not want another full-scale war, but they also can't be seen as being too harsh in reining in Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or they might get criticized for, pushing too hard against those fighting Israel. So they're in a tight spot. And I think that so far they have not joined in as far as we know. That will make a big difference if that changes.
Abdel Bari Atwan, what do you make of the fact that Hamas is staying out of it so far?
Well, Hamas is committed fully to a truce, which they actually signed with the Israeli government after the mediation of the Egyptian government. So I am surprised why Benjamin Netanyahu authorized this assassination attempt against the leader of one of the Al-Jihad leader and provoke more escalation on Gaza, which is under siege for the last 10 years or so. I am surprised if Hamas committed itself completely to this truce. Why Benjamin Netanyahu is actually blowing everything up and creating this kind of problem, killing a man and his wife, and also killing another son of another Jihad leader in Damascus. I believe he is trying to cling to power. He is doing it for his political aim in order to be elected as Israeli prime minister. So the Gazan people are paying a heavy price for that. And we don't know what will happen in the coming few days. It could be escalation, it could be a full-scale war. And the people in Gaza who are besieged, again, I repeat, besieged for the last 10 years, and the unemployment there is more than 80% among young people. People are suffocated. United Nations saying that Gaza will be not the place to live in few years' time. So why, in the top of that, here the Israeli government attacking and assassinating people there in order to provoke some sort of a military confrontation?
So you're saying, Abdel Bari, that Palestinians don't make the distinction between Islamic Jihad and Hamas?
They do. Yeah, they do. Hamas is a responsible power in Gaza. Hamas committed itself fully to the truce. Hamas actually put pressure on Islamic Jihad to stay away from any confrontation with the Israelis, not to practice any kind of resistance against the Israeli. So Hamas was rewarded by the Israeli, by Benjamin Netanyahu of this provocation. So now the people are putting pressure on Hamas to actually launch missiles against the Israeli to take revenge from their leaders who were killed, as his wife was killed. Dalia and Tel Aviv saying that, there are rockets. These rockets did not kill any Israeli, while these kind of attacks still continue in Gaza. And more than 5 Palestinians were killed, whether in Damascus or in Gaza itself. Fishermen in Gaza were not allowed to continue their business as usual. They are not allowed to fish in the Gaza Mediterranean there, or the sea and the Gaza. So this is the problem. We have to look at that situation, difficult situation, where the Palestinians live under this Israeli bombardment from time to time. This is the picture. You know, any rockets which actually launched by Islamic Jihad is a reaction to the Israeli provocation, to the Israeli assassination. If they didn't, they were actually, they are in very difficult situation, but they don't want to face any Israeli bombardment, any Israeli missiles.
All right, let me bring in at this
Israel
point.
is a major power.
Let me bring in at this point Benham Ben Taleblu from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate from Washington. Benham, you heard there Abdelbari Atwan say that there's a domestic politics calculus in all of this. Benjamin Netanyahu hoping to get mileage out of it for his domestic audience. What do you make of the timing of all this?
Well, actually, I'd zoom out of the picture a little bit. I know that this is about Gaza and Israel, Palestinian Islamic Jihad versus Hamas, versus, again, the State of Israel. But I take a little bit of a wider approach to this. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is Iran's favorite proxy in that area, actually. And it's when you look at some of the shaky relationship that Iran has had with Hamas and actually tried to reestablish after Iran has helped the Assad regime in Syria regain control, that hasn't been the history of the relationship with PIJ, with Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So taking a little bit of a broader perspective here, we have to ask ourselves, would Iran be the primary underwriter or backer of such a massive retaliation response to an assassination? And I think that if anyone is happy right now, it's the Islamic Republic of Iran. And figuring in how this local conflict, this local escalation, may not necessarily be about domestic politics, because I would disagree with that, may actually be about a larger geostrategic picture. That for the past couple of years now, the Islamic Republic of Iran, through its myriad proxy networks in the region, has been slowly seeking to conventionally encircle Israel, kind of putting a knife to its neck, if you will, to erode Israel's space for policy options, erode Israel's space for maneuver, and to make the norm to make the events that Dalia was talking about the kind of the public shutdowns, the slowing economy, the political pressure, become a new normal for that state. So it's kind of a small stranglehold.
But they lost two senior commanders.
Taking a step back from the U.S. perspective
Well, they lost one senior commander, and the other one escaped assassination. Excuse me.
Yes, that's right. But you know, most unfortunately, as you see with ISIS, as you saw with Al-Qaeda, leadership decapitations are important. They kept the terrorist group off balance. But again, the rank and file do emerge. And I think what is important to note is that, yes, while the leadership is gone, the arsenal is still there. And the arsenal is on full display right now, likely Syrian and Iranian provided weaponry.
Mohammed Moranti, do you agree that what's happening at the border between Israel and Gaza has more to do with with the showdown between Israel and Iran?
Well, your previous guest made a comparison between the Palestinian resistance and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but we know quite well that ISIS and Al-Qaeda were residing quite comfortably alongside the Golan Heights and tolerated by the Israeli regime for years. And senior Israeli regime figures, as well as think tank figures, said that they preferred ISIS to the Syrian government, and they admitted supporting and treating Al-Qaeda combatants. So I think ISIS and Al-Qaeda can be more easily compared to the Israeli apartheid regime than the Palestinian resistance. It's sort of a reminder of how apartheid South Africa was depicted in Western countries. Back then, the ANC was a terrorist organization in the Western media, and indeed in the United States, it was a terrorist organization. Nelson Mandela was a terrorist who was barred from entering the United States legally until after his presidency came to an end. In 2008, it was when it was removed from the U.S. law. But, and I also find it quite strange that in your package before the debate, there was a failure to point out that in both attacks, one in Damascus, which was of course a violation of Syrian sovereignty, which is something that the Israelis do all the time, that a family member was killed, and the same is true in Gaza. So again, when it comes to Palestinians, civilians, innocents, they really don't mean much in the Western media. And
but my question again, Mohammed, the question again is this part of you know, the showdown between Israel and Iran, or is this about what's going on at the border with Gaza?
I think it has more to do with the survival of Netanyahu as the Israeli prime minister. He, after all, and his wife are facing corruption charges. And over the last couple of years, and between elections and during elections, he carries out provocations in order to push the general population in his direction. He's facing a very difficult situation now. So I think that has more to do with his own survival than anything else, because obviously the Israelis are not going to achieve anything by punishing the Palestinian population and by carrying out these provocations. I think the most important thing that the many advocates of Israel fail to see is that the Palestinian people have their own agenda. They are not proxies. They are a people who have been colonized, marginalized, ethnic cleansing has been carried out, they're demonized, especially in the West, and they have a right to resist. And as in past, in South Africa, they were demonized, these people are demonized today as well. And that is why the Israelis can carry out attacks with impunity.
Dalia Scheindlin, you heard both Abdel Bari Atwan and Mohammed Morandi say this has to do with the fact that Israel doesn't have a government right now.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to weigh in on that point about the domestic politics. All of us have been asking that question since this morning. And in a weird way, it seems like Netanyahu has not always in the past resorted to using wars or starting wars to actually win elections. I want to point out that in 2015, there was no war escalation before the elections, not in April of 2019, and not in September of 2019. You could argue that there was an escalation in 2012, just prior to elections, when Netanyahu was running again for office. But there was at least a back and forth that led to the escalation prior to the assassination at the time of Ahmed Jabari that started the war that we now call pillar of defense. But it's not always Netanyahu's tactic. And so I wasn't quick to jump to that conclusion. However, as my colleague from the Institute for the Defense of Democracies pointed out, this is not exactly something that is great for Israel right now. It's probably making Iran happy, I think were his words, seeing that Israel is kind of halfway shut down and destabilized and has a sense of a sort of pincer movement on the various fronts. The South, there's concerns about it, overflowing to the north. I'm not sure how making Iran satisfied with the result, including if there's a war, that would probably be something that suits Iran's general approach to destabilizing Israel's fronts. Why would Israel want to do that? It's a little bit hard to explain that, other than this suspicious timing of Netanyahu being in a kind of panicky mode and clinging to power. Again, I would be cautious about psychoanalyzing him or directly accusing him of starting a war.
We'll pick up, Dalia, I'm gonna interrupt you. We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. And we're speaking on a day of tit-for-tat rocket attacks after the targeting of two Islamic Jihad leaders by Israel. One in the Gaza Strip who was killed, another whose son and another family member, a grandchild, were killed in a Damascus apartment. With us to talk about it is pollster and political consultant Dalia Scheindlin, who is with us from Tel Aviv. From London, Abdel Bari Atwan, editor-in-chief of the digital news website Al-Ra'i Al-Yum. From Tehran, Mohammed Morandi, associate professor at the University of Tehran. And from Washington, D.C., Behnam Ben-Taleblu, research fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Yeah, Islamic Jihad, which, as we were saying, often works in tandem with Hamas, but they are two distinct groups. Anka Ula has more.
A 360 square kilometer strip of land bordering southwest Israel, Gaza is home to several Palestinian militant groups. While Hamas is the largest of these and has effectively ruled the enclave since 2007, Palestinian Islamic Jihad is arguably the most violent. The group was established in the early 1980s, inspired by the Iranian Revolution and the Muslim Brotherhood. Today, Islamic Jihad gets its funding, weapons, and guidance from Tehran. The Al-Quds Brigades is the group's military wing, the second largest armed group in Gaza after Hamas's Izz al-Din al-Qassam brigades. Historically, the two have worked together to launch attacks on Israel, united by a shared goal: the violent destruction of the Jewish state. But unlike Hamas, Islamic Jihad is not involved in the political process. It refuses to negotiate with Israel, favoring violence over diplomacy. These days, Islamic Jihad often carries out attacks independently of Hamas. Since the 2014 truce between Israel and Hamas, the group is responsible for most of the rocket strikes coming from the Gaza Strip. Israel says this is because of the group's commander, Baha Abu al-Atta, who was killed in an Israeli airstrike on Tuesday morning. The Israeli army described him as a powerful figure in Gaza, who often acts alone, without instruction even from Tehran. It's far from the first time Israel has carried out a targeted assassination on a member of an enemy faction. The strategy used to be a mainstay of Israeli policy. Both Hamas and Islamic Jihad have been targeted in the past. In recent years, however, Israel has largely abandoned these efforts, making this recent attack a significant escalation with Gaza, and by extension, Iran.
Dalia Shanlin, just before the break, you were saying it doesn't look like it's about domestic politics, but...
No. What I was saying was that in the past, we can't always accuse Prime Minister Netanyahu of having started wars in order to improve his political position. But this time, it's a little bit hard to understand the precise timing and logic without the context of the politics. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a direct, let me start this war and then it will improve my political situation. But what I was going to point out is that there could be consequences that benefit him politically, even if he didn't do it just for that reason. I don't know. Those consequences, first and foremost, have dominated the news today, particularly the idea that it might be easier now for the two largest parties that won the September elections, Blue and White, which actually won the elections, and Likud, might be able to go into a unity government. Up until now, they've been resisting it, each one for their own reasons. This creates a situation of a national security emergency that very well could be a sort of excuse for both sides to drop some of their previously zero-sum demands and possibly go into a coalition together. There is talk and speculation and rumors about that going on today. We don't know if that will continue, but it's one possible consequence. If there's a full-scale war and it becomes a drawn-out operation, this could also even postpone a decision about going into a third election, which is something that's been, a possibility ever since this political quagmire following the September elections.
Benem Ben Taliblu, are you still zooming out, or do you agree with Dalia Shanlin that Benjamin Netanyahu does stand to gain from this?
I think, again, and me not being at all an expert in Israeli domestic politics, my focus is more Iran and security in the Middle East. So I'll have a tendency to want to zoom out. But going into the super micro level, this could also be an Occam's razor approach here. Yes, the Israelis had pressed pause on the assassinations of major senior officials in terrorist organizations. But the Occam's razor approach here, that the simplest explanation will likely hold, is one that they figured that this person at this prominent position in Palestinian Islamic Jihad was worth taking this calculated risk to go after. Now, it comes amid Israel has become more willing to show its hand as it strikes Iranian positions in Syria, Iranian positions in Iraq, as well as talks about the Iranian attempts to make Hezbollah's rockets in the north into missiles, talk of this precision guidance munitions kits that Iran is trafficking throughout the region. So if you overlay that macro level with the micro level that Israel has always been cognizant of this individual's talents and flexibilities, you could have a micro-macro. I'm not one who tends to believe that situations of life and death are used and abused for purposes of domestic politics.
Yeah, are people paying attention, by the way, where you are right now? I mean, we've seen Donald Trump has been wanting to disengage from the region. We're not hearing about that deal of the century from his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, much these days. What with impeachment hearings about to go into open session on Wednesday, are people paying attention to this in Washington?
Not enough, and I think that's an excellent point to bring up. Fortunately, finally, I would say, Iraq is coming back into the fore. There is talk, there is discussion, there is increased media coverage, but also not enough of the Iraqi protests in there. There's, of course, a little bit of coverage on the protests in Lebanon. But in the aggregate, Iran and its nuclear program appear to have this outsized focus on Washington. And just to kind of riff off of what the other colleague, our guest, your guest in Tehran was mentioning about South Africa, if there's anything related here to South Africa, it's that I would love to see the South Africa model applied to Iran. Because the outsized focus is Iran and its nuclear program here in Washington, wouldn't it be great if a way to reduce most of these regional hotspots and tensions is if Tehran did what South Africa did with its nuclear program and gave it up?
All right, we'll talk about that perhaps in a moment, but I want to ask at this point, Abdelbari Atwan, when you look at the street protests that are going on in Baghdad, when you look at what's going on in Beirut, we had on Riyadh Al Sol Square this Wednesday, people branding signs, this Tuesday rather, that said, who's afraid of a revolution, as banks announced they'd remain on strike. Is that bad news for Iran at this point?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm surprised why your guest and the states squeezing Iran and demonizing it in this incident in particular. We have a crime here, nothing to do with Iran. The Israeli attacked and killed more than 5 people, some of them leaders of Al-Jihad organization. So nothing to do with Iran. I'm surprised demonizing Iran all the time, saying Iran did this, Iran did that. This is an Israeli provocation. This is an Israeli assassination attempts, which actually killed people, innocent people. So this is what we should concentrate.
But Abdelbari, is this happening?
Is
this happening in a vacuum? I mean, is this happening completely outside of the context of what's going on right now in the wider region?
My friend, listen to me. The Palestinian cause is there before the mullahs took power in Iran. This is even there, and the resistance was there during the Shah rules of Iran. So we cannot actually jump to the conclusion that this is something to do with Iran. Nothing to do with Iran, at all. This Hamas has nothing to do with Iran. We have to be frank here. Look, Netanyahu just a few days ago appointed Naftali Bennett, who is a very radical right-wing politician. He appointed him as a defense minister. Naftali Bennett always advocating for the destruction of Gaza, rooting out Hamas and Al-Jihad al-Islami, using the maximum power against him. Why Netanyahu appointed him just a few days ago? He was preparing for this attack against Gaza. He was preparing for the death of people, whether from jihad or innocent people in Gaza. So we have to put these facts into our consideration. We shouldn't all the time saying Iran, 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 Iran. If the Israeli has a problem with the Iranian nuclear program, let them go and deal with Iran. Why should they go and bomb innocent people in Gaza and Damascus? This is the question. About the demonstration in the streets of Beirut and Baghdad, it is legitimate demonstration. Those people are actually demonstrating against corruption, against regime which actually lacks the minimum of democracy and human rights. That's a problem we are facing. And who is actually appointing the regime in Iran? It is America. This is the outcome of the American invasion and occupation of Tehran, of Iraq. This is the problem. We have to concentrate on this. Who bring those people corrupt?
Mohammed Morandi,
who actually import?
Sorry, I thought you were finished. Mohammed Morandi, let me ask you, because especially when it comes to Iraq, protesters there angry at both Washington and Tehran, saying that they want to settle their own affairs and no longer have outside players. You heard earlier Behnam Ben Taleblu saying perhaps Israel has reason to feel a little bit under the radar in Washington these days. Your thoughts on where Israel and Iran stand when it comes to the broader region?
Well, I think first I have to point out that the apartheid regime in South Africa developed its nuclear weapons with the assistance of the apartheid regime in Israel. the Israeli regime, which has nuclear weapons, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, but the Israeli regime gave those nuclear weapons and the technology to apartheid South Africa. And therefore, again, that's another resemblance that exists between the two countries. So it would be good if the regime of Israel would follow the South African model, not only in giving up nuclear weapons, but also giving up apartheid, because that is the issue. The issue is not Judaism, it's Zionism and supremacism. But beyond that, I'd also like to point out that the killing of innocents in Palestine, or in Syria again, which is a violation of Syrian sovereignty, is something that is carried out easily and with impunity. When we see every time the Palestinians carry out demonstrations in Gaza, the Israeli soldiers and their snipers take out young kids or target their kneecaps and kill them on a regular basis, then it just gives them a green light to do whatever they want. And contrary to
But when you look, my question's about the broader context here right now. Mohammed Morandi, my question's about the broader context right now. Do you get the sense that both Israel and Iran have reason to feel under pressure?
No, I don't think the Iranians feel under pressure at all.
Even when Hezbollah is contested in Lebanon, and when you have in Iraq people telling Muqtada al-Sadr to go away and Iran-backed militias to go away?
Well, you have people in Iraq from different organizations saying different things. There's not one voice in Iraq. The Iraqi government was elected through elections, and the same is true in Lebanon. Hezbollah in Lebanon has a huge support base, both among Shias, Sunnis, and the Christians. And 30% of Sunnis in the recent elections voted for candidates that are aligned to the Hezbollah coalition. And the same is true in Iraq. What the Iranians believe, and as your guests in London rightly pointed out, is that the corruption must be rooted out in Iraq and in Lebanon. But who is the government that destroyed Iraqi infrastructure? Who is the government that destroyed Iraq? Who is the government that actually helped Saddam Hussein in the 1980s and along with the Europeans gave him chemical weapons to use against his own people? Western countries were helping him massacre people with chemical weapons. At that time, they were preventing it from even being discussed in the UN Security Council. Later on, they flipped and they became antagonists of Iraq.
All true, but that is all true what you're saying, Mohammed. But that was 2003. Now we're in 2019.
Well, the United States occupation in Iraq lasted until way after 2003. And when the United States and the Europeans, along with the Saudis and other governments in the region, were supporting the extremists in Syria, and we know that from General Dempsey, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said in 2014 in a Senate hearing that U.S. allies were funding ISIS. We know from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that the United States knew that the extremists were the dominant force in Syria. But according to General Flynn, the United States took a willful decision to support its allies in the region in supporting these groups. We know from WikiLeaks that Hillary Clinton knew that Saudi Arabia and others were supporting ISIS. And then ISIS went into Iraq. So who created the monster of ISIS and al-Qaeda in Syria? And even right now in Idlib,
we can have that discussion whether it was Bashar al-Assad who emptied the prisons, etc. But I want to bring the discussion back to the topic at hand, which is the current pressures that we have between Iran and Israel. And we're seeing domestic pressures on the Israeli side, what with the inability to form a government, which we talked about in part one. And we're seeing domestic issues on the Iranian side. On Sunday, for the first time since he was reelected, Iran's president appeared to lash out at hardliners. Hassan Rouhani alluding to the case of a jailed businessman who got rich under predecessor Maumoon Ahmadinejad.
I declare here that I ask the judiciary, which is confronting million and billion Toman corruption cases to explain to the people how it's fighting against billion-dollar corruption cases.
Abdelbari Atwan, we see there are domestic divisions in Iran. We see the pressure from those U.S. sanctions. What's that going to mean when it comes to proxy groups like Hezbollah and like Islamic Jihad?
You know, it's normal. Hezbollah is a resistance movement. They actually fought to liberate the southern Lebanon actually from the Israeli occupation. And the same thing, Hezbollah, or the same thing, Hamas is a resistance group. Al-Jihad al-Islami is a resistance group. You know, if there is no Israeli occupation, if there is no actually Israeli sanction against 2 million people in Gaza, they have very little electricity, nearly no fresh water there, and no jobs at all for their people. So this is the problem is the occupation. If there is no occupation, there is no resistance.
But you're saying that the support from Iran will continue?
Why not? Why the Iranians should not support the Palestinian people if they are resisting the occupation, the apartheid regime in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem? This is a normal thing. So why the Americans supporting the Israeli who are actually bombing Gaza between now and then, who actually occupying the Palestinian territories, who killed the two-state solution, and there is no peace process completely. So this is, you know, we should not blame the victims. Here we are blaming the victims. If the Israeli has a problem with the Iranian, okay, why don't the Israeli go and bomb the Iranian, for example? Why they bomb people in Gaza? Simply because they know the Iranian will react, and they have the power in order to actually revenge any Israeli attack. This is the problem. So Gaza is besieged. I am from Gaza. Listen to me, please. I am from Gaza. I was born in Gaza. My family in Gaza. You know, people, they don't have food in Gaza. They don't have medicine in Gaza. My sister died simply because there is no proper hospital in order to treat them. So we have to remember that 2 million people besieged in Gaza. They cannot leave. They cannot live like normal. The United Nations saying Gaza in the edge of famine, and it's unlivable in few years. So why we don't look at this problem? Why always saying, yeah, there is a jihad, there is Iran, no. We have to look at to blame the Israeli. Why they killed the peace process? Why they killed the two-state solution? Why Netanyahu appointed a very radical defense minister who would like to destroy Gaza? Why the people in Gaza cannot fish like normal people? Why they cannot enjoy their life? Why they don't have electricity and proper electricity and water? That's the question. If we solve the problem of the Palestinian, if there is a peace process, if there is actually a peaceful settlement, if there is application of the international community, the United Nations resolutions, I don't think we will have any problem.
Any problems? Let me ask Behnam Ben Taleblu on this. Do you take the point from Abdelbari Atwan?
You know, if one genuinely does want to improve the situation, not just in Gaza, but in the Levant, why not decouple Iran from the local forces that it's created, cultivated, and trained, and then have any kind of political process play out afterwards? You know, you mentioned earlier about the sanctions pressure on Iran and some of the follow-on effects of Iran's proxy forces, or even the states that Iran supports in the region, such as the Bashar Assad regime in Syria, the Ba'athist regime in Syria, for instance. Yes, you know, it's been more than 1 year now since the U.S. has restored every single penalty waived by the JCPOA nuclear deal. And not only that, Donald Trump has added to those sanctions and penalties and designations. And an objective macroeconomic assessment would tell you that unilaterally, the U.S. has been able to do more damage to the Iranian economy than about what took 10 years to do multilaterally. So that is an impressive non-military achievement for the U.S. in its pressure policy against Iran. Then starting in the spring, you started to see some reports about
unless you're an Iranian citizen.
Talking about fundraising for Hezbollah. Well, no, it's impressive if you don't believe in fighting a war in the Middle East. You know, the regime talks about medicine shortages. If you look at Iranian data provided by the Iranian Statistical Organization itself, pharmaceutical imports both from Europe and from China have gone up, but there still are shortages. This is one reason out of many why there is such a chasm between state and society in modern Iran. When we talk about these sanctions, though, to go back to the proxy point, it is going to take more time to bleed the regime of revenue. The problem is it's an ideological regime that is committed to these multiple foreign wars, and only if it listened in beautiful rhyming, powerful nationalistic Persian chants from the periphery to the center in Iran when they say, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran, or forget Assad, think about us, or leave Syria, think about us. Perhaps that could help decouple Iran from being the patron to some of these proxies in the region and help create a more sustainable kind of predicate for peace talks, whether it's in Gaza or the Levant or elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean.
A lot more questions to ask. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank Behnam Ben Taleblu for joining us from Washington, Dalia Scheindlin in Tel Aviv, Abdelbari Atwan from London, and Mohammed Marandi from Tehran. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Catalina, who is with us from our Media Watch desk. And we are seeing a lot of reactions to what's been going on and what's continuing to unfold with those tit-for-tat rocket attacks we're seeing.
Yes, Francois. So evidently there's a lot of reaction in Twitter today concerning the political timing of this operation, as Netanyahu just recently named over the weekend far-right politician Naftali Bennett as Minister of Defense, just at the same time as Benny Gantz is trying to form a new government. But over to what's happening on the ground, there's a lot of images going around, especially coming out of Israel. Here we can see a busy highway in Israel. This was captured by a traffic camera. We could see the moment there's an explosion, there's the missile attack. Right here we could see a busy train station in Tel Aviv. People trying to evacuate the train station, trying to avoid debris from the area. And here are more images from the highway. People are just... they're waiting outside of their cars. It's recommended in this situation that people stay away from vehicles as there's income. They wait for the alert to be over. Today, showing the security measures, the heavy security measures. This is the Dizengoff Center, and for the first time in recent history, it has closed its doors for security reasons. This is what we call the Red Alert app, which is an app that notifies its users which areas to avoid in the region when there's missile attacks. So here we could see earlier, these were the areas that, and they're continuing to avoid, they're continuing to show areas that civilians should avoid that could be dangerous. This is on the Israeli side of the border. And as you can see, many users saying that their app hasn't stopped alerting them of incoming missile attacks, this user with 36 notifications. Onto the Gaza Strip of the side, Amnesty International has reported that 5 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed by Israeli airstrikes. And as they say, this is deeply worrying, and they are closely monitoring the situation. This is another image that has been shared a lot on the Gaza Strip side of the border. This is a Palestinian journalist, and this is apparently a tower that has been hit by an Israeli airstrike. And as this journalist is saying, there is too much news circulating around as well. So definitely to be careful with what's going around and what to publish and what not. But here's more images of this building that has been hit by an Israeli airstrike as well.
All right, and while all this is going on, this flare-up at the border and the fears that it could escalate into something even bigger, an EU court with a ruling that has more to do with the West Bank and that could spark anger.
Yes, so just recently the EU court, they ruled that food products that come from Israeli-occupied territories, they must be labeled in order to avoid misleading consumers. This is in particular for settlement areas that they have to come with special labels. And as media is saying, this is likely to spark anger coming from Israel. So there's more considering headlines. And the reason for this ruling is that they want it to be easily identifiable so that no longer the products carry a generic Made in Israel tag on their products.
Catalina Marchand-Deabreu, many thanks for that. We want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.